Virtuoso musician David Hollander felt the divine music in his heart throughout his life that most of us long for. Today, we are blessed to have a glimpse of just that. With enormous thirst for knowledge and music, let us welcome Mr. David Hollander. My understanding is that music has been with the living organisms since the beginning of time. So different animals actually have their music as well. Birds sing, they have different notes that they can actually do, that they can make for different purposes.
That's right.
So, and he's actually suggested uh, music theory. So when this music theory came into exist in our civilization?
I believe, as far as people composing music, theory has been around from the beginning. We know that there's always been music. It's so interesting. You mentioned the birds just a minute ago. I just wanted to point out to you that the birds always whistle in tune.
Right.
You never hear a bird call that's not in tune. And it's because the very pitches that we select for music, they're all related to each other. They're all harmonics of each other. And so that's why they fit together like a family. I remember when I was in high school, I was interested in amateur radio. And amongst the different items that they had in the lab, there was an audio oscillator. And it was simply a dial on the front of a box. And as you revolve the dial, you'd hear the note go, ooh, like that. I don't have much range of pitch, but it'd go from very low to very high. Right. And then you realize that with those infinite number of pitches, that certain select ones are the ones that create a harmony, or the scale, the notes of the scale, or the fact that the notes seem to relate to each other. And it's because of the vibrations of the sound are all multiples, mathematical multiples of each other, which makes it possible for something to sound tonal, the sound that it goes together. So I was answering a question that I got off the subject already. Could you repeat your question?
I think I kind of got the idea of it. I was really trying to understand the history of the music theory that you mentioned. Yes. And as you mentioned also, but I can actually, kind of try to understand a little more on that, as you mentioned, that music theory has been there since since the composition of music has been done by human different musicians, I would say.
Well, so, the theory, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Just that the theory is the analysis, isn't it? It's the It's the analysis of the sound that we have, but there's been a kind of order to music which makes it palatable or listenable. It makes sense, and it's largely not only on these different pitches, which are all mathematical relations to each other, but in addition, in terms of rhythm, after all, you're assigning time, periods of time to the different notes. And if you look at the way we conceive of rhythm, I think to myself how when I was a child, we used to march like soldiers, little boys. We'd march and we'd say left, right, left, right, left, right. Now, why is it we go la, da, da, da? We emphasize one over the other. It's a kind of strong, weak, strong, weak. And if you take that analysis where two consecutive pulses, one is going to be stronger than the other. And then when you return, of course, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak. It all makes sense. It all sounds good. Now, if we were to count those impulses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You notice that 1 is the strongest. 3 is second strongest. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like a W, sort of. And
right.
then,
so it's making a wave.
well, I'm thinking of passage of time and how with rhythm that not only is it 1, 2, 3, 4, but if we do it and expand that, it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I've done 4 samples. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. And each time I said 1, the strongest one is the first. The second strongest is the third. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So we've augmented this idea of strong, weak by the pulses of 1 and 3.
Right.
Making sense? Oh,
yes.
Good.
Yeah.
And then we can expand that beyond that. I gave you a passage of time, which we would call measure of time. It's a measure, and the different beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4. The 16 beats that we heard within that unit of time. Well, now, if we were to take those units, those measures, and expand them so that we have not just one measure of 16 pulses, but we could have 4 measures, 16 pulses each. And again, that hierarchy would still maintain itself. Well, that's what makes possible the sensibility of music. All music originally came from folk songs. So now we take a piece of music. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. So the same thing. It's strong, weak, strong, weak. So those measures, it still holds true. And as we expand into a larger phrase of music, it would also hold true. And that's what gives music that sense of logic. That's why I used to watch these popular music, these bands, and they'd be playing and playing, and all of a sudden they know this is where we stop, because they could hear that internal hierarchy of the beats where we stop when it's appropriate. And the audience hears that too, whether they're aware of it consciously or not. So it's a fusion of different pitches with the rhythm that makes music happen.
Okay.
That's why.
So what I'm actually understanding in the mathematical terms, that there are repetition of 4 and multiplications of 4, right?
Yes.
So is it always multiplication of 4?
Yes, it's always 4, or it could be an 8-bar phrase, or it could be a 16. I say bar meaning measure, or
Okay.
it could be a 16 measure period. They call that a period when it's that long.
Okay.
So it's
So
all
if it's 16, if you go beyond 16, then it's a new series again. It's a repetition of the previous one.
Well, with folk music, or with music that's not thought out, like classical music is, that would not happen. But with classical music, the composer has the opportunity to invent and be little bit irregular. Franz Schubert, for example, would take what should have been a 4-bar phrase and then add an extra bar, so it'd be a 5-bar phrase. And the irregularity of it was a little bit disturbing, but at the same time, it made sense, and then you accepted it.
Okay.
So that's, and then with music, when it begins to evolve within a piece, develop, there will be groups, phrases that will be maybe just 3 bars, 3 measures, or 5 measures, or whatever it might be, for creative reasons.
Okay, so that was my next question, that whether it can be different than 4. It can be 3, 5 as well. Okay.
Yes. Not with folk music, but certainly with composed music.
Sure. Okay. So that's very interesting because when you say composed music, so it's still natural, right? Is it not natural, or is it? Would you consider it as more synthetic in nature?
Well, that's such an interesting idea. It is natural, ultimately.
Right.
In the end, final analysis, you think that's the way it should have gone all along. But in the moment that you first hear it, you would think to yourself, "Oh, that doesn't sound right." And then it needs to correct itself as you get into it.
Okay, so I would then say that it's more complex than normal folk music.
Yes.
Right.
That's right.
So the complexity is higher over there. Okay, that sounds good. So I was also trying to understand at the same time. So classical music is, of course, the basis of all different types of music that we generally hear all around the world, like the contemporary music that we hear, right? And there are some musics as well, like after one point, these notes will become such that it won't be any music anymore. It would be noise. But there is a transition in between where you probably, we all actually watch a lot of movies, and there are some movies that are horror movies. And in horror movies, the music is it's very odd. It sounds very odd, right? So that's why it actually provokes those kind of negative emotions.
Yes, you're so right about that.
So how is that intentionally adding more off notes into it?
I'd love to be able to explain it to you. You see, when you sound 3 notes at the same time, you have a chord. And our ears, which are accustomed to traditional harmonies, will expect certain chords. And when one chord goes to another chord, you think, "Oh, that's right. That's the way it should be." And you feel complete with it. But there are other chords which are alarming. There are some chords which anticipate something that's going to happen. I wish I had a keyboard with me because I could illustrate it to you, but maybe I could just go to the piano and plunk out the notes, and you'll just hear the sound.
Sure.
So here, can you hear me speaking?
I can hear you speaking.
Wonderful. Well, here is a simple chord. It's
right.
3 notes. They're all harmonics of each other. So if we play a scale and we play the chord that is identified with each of those tones, the first tone is this one. The second tone is this one. The third is this one. The fourth tone is this one. The fifth tone is this one. The sixth one is this one. And the seventh one, which is disturbing, is this one. That one is disturbing. Why? Because all these chords are either major or minor. So they're all major, minor, major, minor. major, major, minor, and this chord here, which is so disturbing, is called diminished. That's because you don't really know what is the key center, and traditionally this chord is going to go to this chord, or this chord. Those are called diminished seventh chords, and they're very scary. You hear that kind of cutting in scary movies because the diminished seventh always precedes a minor chord. We always equate major with happy and minor with sad. So when they sound these diminished seventh chords, that you know you're going to get something upsetting in a minute. So that's just the nature of music. It reflects our human experience when there are moments of joy or moments of sorrow, or moments of doubt, which would be when you hear that evil diminished seventh chord.
Right. That's so.
Chord you can't
so amazing.
It is.
Wow.
There's another chord which is the opposite of the diminished seventh, and that's called the augmented chord. The augmented chord, for me, I think it conveys astonishment, and here I'll show it to you.
Sure.
Here's our major chord here that we're so familiar with. This is the augmented chord. There are some more augmented chords. I'm sure you've heard movie scores that have that sequence of chords, or oh my gosh, what's going to happen?
Right. Right.
So music can speak like that with everything but the words. It conveys, it somehow speaks to us, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's so interesting as well that, I'm now thinking that how we first started relating these kind of specific notes to specific emotions. In general, the notes that you just pressed on your piano, these are, it gives you like something is going to happen. But before that, you pressed some notes that was more of that I generally hear in the thriller movies.
Right.
And there are some notes also that can be literally like gives you a chill, like horror level of music. So, or the music of the dead, as we can say as well. So those are very different. It's not really sad. It's like it's a little scary on that side.
Right.
But what I'm actually trying to say is now that how or at which point we started relating these kind of notes as a humankind, we started relating these kind of notes with these kind of emotions.
That's so interesting. I don't know if I know the earliest music that we have that's written down is church music.
Okay.
And the earliest example is from the year 900. Somebody by the name of Guillemar Malchaud wrote a mass, and that's the first example of written music, of printed music that we have, written music that we have.
Okay, so I have just one question about this. Yeah. So when you say written music, you are saying about the music that is in the note form?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
So you can see on a page, on a piece of paper, you can see the relationship of the notes to each other. You can see if the notes are going higher or lower. And a lot of research has been done with, this is called medieval music, where we can learn by studying exactly how the music must have sounded back then. It's a kind of notation that we don't use today, but we do know from research how that music sounded. And then, of course, music became more like it is today by the year 1600. I say that, 1600, because 1600 was the beginning of that was when the first opera was written.
Oh, okay.
And with opera, which is always dramatic and emotional and conveys moods, there was the use of major and minor keys, major and minor chords to convey the emotion of the person playing the part.
Sure.
And that was the beginning of music, which was more like what we hear today. That was called the beginning of the Baroque period, which consists of all the Baroque composers ending with Bach.
Okay.
Johann Sebastian Bach was the last of the Baroque composers, and that was the end of the period.
Okay. When you say Baroque, could you actually explain that? What is
Well,
Baroque?
it means decorative, of course,
Decorative. Got it.
and elaborate. And the Baroque period, with its Baroque art, for example, how decorative that was, and the music of the Baroque composers is full of ornamentation. They have little trills, little
Okay.
little decorations on certain notes, and the music was so complex. There was a mass that was written for 83 different parts. That's
Wow.
huge. That's more than scores for orchestra conductors are printed. It was so they favored very elaborate and complex and very decorative writing, and that was up to the time of Johann Sebastian Bach, who was born in 1685 and died in 1750. So the Baroque period has finite dates, 1600 to 1750, the first opera, the death of Bach. And
Okay.
after Bach, then we come to a reaction to all that complicated music, and we hear the music of Haydn and Mozart. These were called classic period composers, where the emphasis was on elegance and symmetry and balance and refinement, as opposed to simplicity, as opposed to what had been with the Baroque period.
When you said that the first written music is in around 900s during that time, I was thinking of music in the East. So in the Indian music, it was mostly not written. So there is no, I don't see that, I don't remember that whether I read anywhere that Indian music, or at least in the note form, it was written. So the earliest book in the world is the Rig Veda. And right after the Rig Veda, then comes the second part of Veda, which is called Sam Veda. So Sam Veda, in you, it was mostly chantings, but they had a very nice, they call it songs. So the whole verses and all those things, they were in songs. But what used to happen that uh, the music with it, they used to come by listening from one generation to another, and they
Right.
still exist, but there were no written notes for that. So they are actually still going for, I think these days probably they wrote it down, the notes and stuff. But the music was always like, you listen and then you learn and then you uh, you transfer to the next generation.
I think that's wonderful. It's a hand-me-down, isn't it?
Right. So Veda was always like that, the book itself, which is the so before the Rig Veda was written, which is the earliest written book in the world. So not printed, written, handwritten, I'm talking about. Before that, Veda was always conveyed from one generation to another by listening. Nobody used to write Veda before that. That's why we call Veda is also known as what is called Shruti. Shruti, the word Shruti means you listen and you remember. You listen and remember. You don't write.
Well,
So that's what I was just remembering. The series that you actually played, na 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 na. So that's also in Indian music, of course. And I loved it when you actually played it because it shows that although the culturally these we were all separate, but in music notes they're actually
Isn't
same.
that amazing? Isn't that remarkable?
Right. That's so remarkable, right? That's so amazing.
Like
And
music, the universal language, something that we
exactly.
can all connect with.
Right, right. And that's what Ter told me as well in the text. So, um, music as a universal language, just like mathematics. Could you explain on that as well?
How that relates to mathematics,
Uh,
or how
the
it's
mathematic
universal.
relationship you already did explain. And if you want to explain more, I'll love to hear that. But how it is, your thoughts of it, like how do you think that it's more universal? One part of the universality of music is definitely that all these different cultures grew up in separate from each other in very early days, but they still have the same basis.
Right?
So beyond this, how universal it is that, say for example, I'm actually thinking in a more of a scientific manner, if a civilization that is not from this planet, could they actually have or understand the same kind of musical notes? Is it that universal?
I would imagine so.
Okay.
I would imagine so, just because principles of sound remain the same,
Okay.
all based on vibrations, and know, different things pick up the vibration and take on the sound.
Sure, sure.
In
Okay.
fact,
Okay.
music has evolved all over the world from the beginning of time. Everybody has music in some context, and everybody has instruments to create
Right.
what the voice does.
Right. Okay. Um in that in that keeping that thought alive a little more, music, we hear music because of the fact that music travels through air, and the air density and the water density is different. Water is more dense than air, of course. Will the same music be heard in the same way in water?
Yes, think about the whales.
Right. Okay.
They have a terrific sound, don't they?
Right.
It all
Yes.
comes through the water.
Right. Right. Right.
I'm
Interesting.
just presuming that they sing when they're underwater.
Right.
Maybe I've never heard of a whale making a sound in the air. That's interesting, isn't it? They
Yeah.
have to be in water to make the sound.
Right.
Fascinating.
So what I'm actually trying to understand is that when if we actually play a classical music underwater, will it produce same kind of will it be able to evoke same kind of emotions because of the density or the way that that the sound would travel, or would hear the sound? Or is it because of the fact that our ear are actually more accustomed to the sounds in the air, because of the our whole body is actually accustomed to the air pressure, not the water pressure?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question, but I know somebody made a recording of whale sounds,
Right.
and they're really beautiful. And
Right.
I think whether you perceive them through water or through air, you'd have the same reaction to the relationship, the pitches, how they relate to each other.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Now, the relationship with mathematics and music. You also mentioned that there is a relationship with Pythagorean theorem with music. Could
With
you,
what?
Pythagoras?
Theorists?
Yes, yes,
Right, and music?
yes.
Right. Well, there have been rules. I really speak knowledgeably about Western civilization, and I don't know that much about other parts of the world, but I can
Sure.
tell you that uh, rules of composition existed uh, very early in the game. Uh, it was known that certain notes harmonized other notes, so they agreed with each other. And over time, um, the rules that it's so interesting. The rules that evolved were the ones that created the most beautiful music. Now, what is the most beautiful music? Well, these composers, they heard each other's music over time and were influenced by each other's music. And there, in the last 400 years, there are certain composers that had a profound effect on the way uh, traditional harmonies sound to this day. And I know that when I was a child, my parents, who were musicians, we had a lot of music in the house. And of course, back then it was days of 78s. You know, 78s. Those were before 33 and a third, the LP, what they call vinyl today. They were a very thick record that if you dropped it, it would break.
Right.
And it went 78 times around. So they're called 78s. And they had a record cabinet. And embossed in the record jackets, these were all 78 albums. And I saw these names, and they were the names of Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven and Schumann and Brahms. And all these composers, they were called the masters. And how do they get to become the masters? Well, these composers ended up learning from these other composers how to write the most beautiful music. And so if you ask Beethoven, he would say, well, Bach was the father of us all. And if
Okay.
you ask Brahms, he would say, well, thank God for Beethoven. Now I know how to write a symphony. So they all look to each other. It's that little clique, that little group of composers, the masters, which have this profound effect on the way traditional music sounds. There were other composers who lived during their times who wrote well, but not in. We wouldn't say it was as special as were the Mozarts and the Haydns and the Beethovens.
Okay. You told me also about your journey a little bit. Could you actually go into that? Because I'm really fascinated by the knowledge that you have on the history of music itself. But you are also a great musician. So, in that sense, when it actually started for you and how it started, as you said, you actually grew up in a musical household,
Well, my parents were musicians.
right?
They had met at Juilliard, and this was before the Second World War. And my father was a cellist. He came from a very musical family himself. His father had been an opera singer, and his father had sung at the um, opera house in Ukraine, the Odessa Opera House.
Right.
And he came to the States and was very, very good. He sang with a competitor of the Metropolitan Opera at that time, which was called the Manhattan Opera. And so he had three sons. One played the violin, that's my Uncle Ralph. One played the piano, that's my Uncle Arthur. And my father, Norman, played the cello. And all three brothers were students at Juilliard at the same time when my father met my mother, who had come from Ohio. My father's father became not only an opera singer, but was also a cantor in the Jewish religion. Instead of the rabbi, the one who sings the words is called the cantor, and the two are on the stage side by side, and the rabbi will read something from the literature, and then the cantor will sing it, and they go back and forth like that. So music was always a very important part of the religion. So he was a cantor, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a Methodist minister, and this was back in the 30s when there was a lot more suspicion about other groups than there is now, even. But so it was a difficult thing for them to get married. One being from a Jewish and the other from a Christian background, but they got married. My mother was a violinist at Juilliard, and after the war, my father got a position in Cleveland, the Cleveland Symphony, and he was a principal. He was assistant principal in Cleveland, where he stayed for 2 years, and then my parents moved to Kansas City, where he was the first cellist in Kansas City for many years. And then I grew up in that home where my mother was a violinist, my father was a cellist. They played. You know, musicians don't make a lot of money, and they had to take everything that came along, whatever there was. So there was always music in the house, either rehearsals for concerts they were giving, or we were taken to concerts that they were playing with orchestras. So there was a great, and then they would teach all day on Saturday, and then they would practice, and then there were always rehearsals in the home. So I heard a terrific amount of music. I was very lucky, I think, to have heard that.
Okay. So, and how do you actually got into the history of music?
Well, when you go to when you go to school and you go to music school or college, one of the courses that they want you to know is the history of music, how it all came about. That's important because you have to understand that when you're playing Bach, Bach did not know how Beethoven sounded or how Mozart sounded or Chopin. So you have to work within the confines of what he understood to be true.
Okay.
And then also, as you study these composers and you see how they impact each other, it's very important to know who came before who and who came after who, and how all that happened. It's interesting that earlier music used far fewer notes or interesting intervals than did later music. If you hear the Baroque music, it's all the primary chords, the major and minor chords. By the time you get to Mozart and Beethoven, you have what's called the seventh chords. Forgive me, I have to go just to show you the sound of it, because It's very important. This is a seventh. It's a triad with an extra note added to it.
Okay.
If you want, a triad is a third away from the next note and a third away from that. So those are the three notes. Now the seventh is the note which is 7 notes from the top. So you have a third, and a third more. That's a 4-note chord. Okay. And I'll show you what it sounds like. I'll take these very fingers and put them on the keys, and you'll see what comes out. Here's the triad. And now I'll add the seventh. That's the difference. With this chord, when you have this chord, and why that chord is so important, because when you hear this, you know you're going to get. So it's a chord that announces something that's going to come up. It paves the way. it's sort of like a magnet. It draws. It's drawn to the chord that follows. So these seventh chords were more prominent in the Romantic. After the classic period, which was Mozart and Haydn and early Beethoven, then comes the Romantic period, which uses these sevenths a lot.
Okay. Okay.
And if you want, of course, as time passes, people begin to hear other notes. You know, they hear that note in the air. So over time, by the end of what's called the Romantic period is middle Beethoven, because he was the beginning of the Romantic writing, middle Beethoven, and ends with Wagner.
Okay.
Which is the end of the 1900s. And after Wagner, then all kinds of interesting chords become available to us. So what happens is that a chord which is a seventh is a triad, is a seventh. But then at the end of the Romantic period, they have what's called the ninth. There it is. Or the 11th. Or the 13th. So you have all these interesting chords that become more common as we come to the end of the 1900s and early 20th century.
Okay. The evolution itself is fascinating.
And I didn't tell you that at the end of the 19th century, in France, there was the Impressionist movement in painting.
Right.
And with Impressionism, of course, with all these evolutions, music is the last to catch on. But music became impressionistic also. And it began to use all these interesting chords that would never have been heard 100 years earlier.
Okay.
And finally, just to round this off, after Impressionism in music, the Impressionist composers, by the way, were Debussy and Ravel, among others. After that came Arnold Schoenberg, who lived in the 20th century and went beyond normal keys, but wrote in such a way that every note, there are 12 notes, every note within the octave was used, and there was no way of knowing as you listened to the music what the tonal center, what the key was. It was called a 12-tone series. And the order, the form of that music was to play these notes which would appear at random. I'll show you the sound of it if you'd like.
Sure.
So there was no way of knowing what the key center was. And but the form of their writing was that the order of those notes would remain consistent, so that there was some logic in the sound of the music. That was called the 12-tone series.
Okay.
And that's what he did.
What is a key center?
Well, it's so interesting you asked that question. Winding back time, going back to traditional harmonies, when we hear music, it's these different chords going from one to the next. And there's a formula where if you have this chord, then it must be followed by that chord. If you have that chord, it must be followed by this chord. And there's a kind of logic where one chord can go to several chords, but this other chord can only go to this one or two chords. I'll show you again, I'll give you an oral sampling of that.
Sure.
So This is called the one chord because it's based on the degrees of the scale are numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So here's the one chord based on that tone. Now the one chord can go to the chord which is based on the fifth tone. That one. It'd be this chord here. So this chord, you go to this chord. This chord can go to this chord. This chord can go to this chord. This chord can go to this chord. Which can then go to this chord. Which can then go to this chord. And finally go to this chord. Which is the same chord we started with. So when you hear that final chord, it's identical to the first chord you heard, and you have a sense of arriving, of now I'm home.
Okay, okay. So, and what I'm hearing is that not only that you have the rule was that, you know, after certain chords have to be there, but it is also that each of these chords can be or should be played for a certain amount of time.
That's so interesting. The rhythm, the pulses, that makes a big difference too. So obviously, the first sound is the first pulse, the first beat is strong, and it has to be the same chord as what you have at the end. And then certain chords that are important will be on strong beats, and notes that are not so important will be on the weaker beats. So
Okay.
it's a little bit like a poem that rhymes. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. Da, 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 da. Chords that are significant will appear on the stronger beats, and it'll make sense. It'll sound musical. It'll be logical.
Okay.
Is that
Okay.
the question?
Yes, yes, yes. But these days, that rule has been broken because it was more of an impressionism has got into the system.
Well, the rules is not broken, but there are many more opportunities.
Okay.
So it still holds true. That's why in popular music, the last chord, the chord that harmonizes the notes at the end of the piece will be the same chord that harmonizes the notes at the beginning.
Okay. Okay. Oh, all right. So, so basically, in your journey, you grew up with music, and then it was a natural progression for you. Then, you know, going to the music school and learning music.
To a certain extent, I wanted to be like my parents.
Okay.
Just in the sense that that's what you wanted to do.
Right.
And I was not a very good piano student when I was a little boy. I didn't enjoy practicing.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
I, the same gripes that everybody has when I got to practice, and then so that was not. But over time, I learned to find ways to make it wonderful for myself.
Okay.
Now, at this age, my God, I can hardly pull myself away from the piano because it's so exciting. I think that when you make mistakes, you have opportunities to learn.
Right.
And every time you make a mistake as you're playing, then you learn, oh, I'm going to do this next time. I'm going to do that next time. And so it's the repetition of the act is so exciting because each time it just gets better and better and better. It's just thrilling.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And I am actually I'm very surprised that you actually particularly uh, used some of those words that you used to find ways to motivate yourself for
Yeah.
practicing. And this is going to be very interesting for many young kids who are actually learning. If you could actually share that, what are the different fun ways uh, that you would incorporate in your practice that would,
Well,
you know.
I think that the most important thing is to learn to play by ear. I
Got it.
think that
Okay.
it's a mistake that people start with the written note. I think that should be the last thing that you do. Imagine if you had an infant or baby, and you told them they could only say a word what they could see in print. They would never get around to speaking.
Exactly, exactly.
What happens is that we learn to speak because we learn from the sound of it. And then after a period of time, we learn, oh, that word looks like this. And
Right.
we learn the picture of the word. So writing comes after the fact. It should be the same thing with any musical instruments. You should play it entirely by ear.
Okay. Right.
And
Okay.
that's a lot more fun because you're just doing what you want to do. You just follow your instincts.
Right.
So that makes a big difference, I think.
Okay. Did you had like perfect pitch?
No, um, I'm supposed to develop it. I have not gotten around to doing that, but
Okay.
I have what's called relative pitch, which is what
Right.
most people have. My father had very good perfect pitch. Um, some people have it and some don't. So I
Right.
think you can develop it.
Right. Right. I can actually also definitely, I would say that not everybody has a relative pitch as well. What I read that about 30% of the musicians have relative pitch compared to, of course, perfect pitch is much less. It's probably about 5 to 10%. But a lot of people generally don't have it as well. So at least, I mean, definitely you had it, had the relative pitch.
Yeah.
So that definitely kind of
Well, relative pitch can be learned.
right,
It can be learned.
right, right. That's also true. Right. Okay.
You know, if you hear the scale la, I don't sing very well. La la la. Then you hear three notes la la la. Then la 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 la. That's a third, and because if you had to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, so how far is this note to this note? Oh, it's five notes away. Da, 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 da. So that interval is called a fifth.
Right.
So you learn to recognize those distances, those intervals.
Right.
The most exciting thing about studying, about playing classical music, is that how you look at the music is very personal. And as you get to become familiar with it, you realize that all these artists played the same piece differently. And
Okay.
it becomes very exciting to see how a performer's personality, his individuality, can impact the sound of the piece.
Okay. Even if they follow the exact note the exact way.
Precisely, even if they follow the exact note, the exact way, it will still be different because it's what that note means to you at that time, whether you emphasize it or play it off. Uh, and what's also very exciting for me is to imagine how it sounded when these composers played their own music. What did it sound like when Chopin played his own music, or when Brahms played his own music? I think particularly about Beethoven, because
Okay.
with Beethoven, he had such an individual way of playing. They say he would break the keys or break the strings. He was passionate, and you could just imagine that kind of a personality. You read about what they were like as people, and then you can hear that in the music. You can hear when he's writing ba 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 ba. He's angry.
Right.
He's
Right.
angry about something.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. That shows.
And then you read stories about Beethoven where he's always getting angry at people. He's always
Oh,
losing his temper, and the music is very autobiographical, and you begin to hear that over time. It's wonderful.
what was his anger about?
Well, um, I don't know what caused it. Um, I know that he had an abusive childhood.
Okay.
Father was an alcoholic. He'd come home with his buddies and wake up the boy who was 10 years old, make him play for his friends in the middle of the night, or make him practice all night long. And father was always drunk. When Beethoven was 15 years old, he gets a job playing the keyboard in the orchestra and arranges that he can receive the father's salary because the father will spend it all on drink. So Beethoven, who's the oldest of three brothers, takes care of the family at the age of 15. I don't know if that would make you necessarily angry, but he had a raw side to him, I'm sure. And and also, of course, as life went on, he was losing his hearing by the age of 20, 21. He was losing his hearing, becoming, and not understanding how or why or what. And as a musician, he's still fighting for his life in the city of Vienna with all the competition. He still had to make it as a musician, let alone composer. And if he can't hear, what chance does he have? So he was fighting for his life at that time, or his musical life, if you want. So he had a lot of frustrations, and in the end, he becomes almost completely deaf.
Okay.
And what's yeah.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to tell you is that the music of Beethoven, more than any composer I can think of, has changed during his lifetime. The early Beethoven, the music that he writes in his early 20s, sounds like Haydn and Mozart, classic period. An example, Mozart, bum, 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 bum. Look at the sequence. Goes up, goes down, one mirrors the other. It's exact parallel, same rhythm. Well, that's the nature of all that music. Well, early Beethoven sounds like that. But then by the time you get to middle Beethoven, this time he's in his 30s and 40s, he's become much more romantic. And then the music is, it's got those seventh chords in it I told you about.
Yes.
It's more lush. And also, for me, the piano has evolved, and it's a much different instrument at the end of his life than it was at the beginning, where he can get all kinds of sound that he couldn't get before. And the keyboard, instead of being this wide, is that wide. So he has a lot of extra notes, a lot more sonority. So middle Beethoven is very romantic. And then you have what's called late Beethoven, which happens by the time he's in his 50s. And the music, of course, is more reflective. But for me, what's even more astonishing is that here's this composer who's just about completely deaf now. He doesn't hear the music of other composers. He hears only his own music, his own development. And you hear music that is, in a way, music of the future, because he has not heard these notes. And when you hear the music that he wrote in his last year, it's otherworldly. It goes way beyond what you could imagine one human life could create. At the end of his life, he gets a commission from a Russian nobleman to write 5 string quartets. A string quartet is 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. It's like a chorus. Chorus will have 4 parts. And that way all chords, I gave you 3-note chords, but in truth, all harmony is based on 4 tones. Because one of those 3 notes is doubled.
Okay.
So that's the rule of harmony. And how these voices go to each other is part of the rules. But at the end of his life, he writes 5 string quartets, which are of another world. And of course, when he had them performed, many people walked out of the audience as it was being performed. They didn't understand them. They didn't appreciate it. But that's a really wonderful thing to discover if ever you have a chance to listen to the last string quartets. He was completely deaf by this time, and they're just wonderful.
Okay.
Really great.
So we are almost coming to an end, but I think one of the most important question that I can think of right now is that your music have inspired so many, but practically and definitely inspired Tear significantly in her with her struggle with her health. So how do you actually see that, and what is your experience on that, and how do you think that it helped her?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that question in so many ways. Because we always think about David in the Bible, who played the harp for King Saul, who was not well.
Okay.
He wanted the music.
Okay.
Music can be fortifying. It can give us strength. It can talk to us in ways that words can't begin to. Some ways it goes beyond words.
Right.
When you hear the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, by the time you get to the end of it, you realize that you're not the person you were when the piece began 30 minutes earlier. It's an evolution that you experience just by listening to it, because in a way you sort of walk in Beethoven's footsteps. Along that same line, another great composer who lived at the end of the 1900s was Gustav Mahler, Mahler. He's only now just becoming fashionable, coming into his time. Mahler wrote 8 symphonies, and each symphony he answers the question of why do we die? Why do we live if only to die? He answers that question in a different way with each of the 8 symphonies. When he had finished his 8th symphony, he realized that Beethoven had written 9 symphonies and died. Dvorak, 9 symphonies, died. Bruckner, 9 symphonies, died. And so on and so forth. So he put off writing his 9th symphony and wrote 2 other major works of art, 2 other major compositions. And only then did he finally come back to his 9th symphony. And that's Gustav Mahler. So it's very helpful to listen to this music because it puts you in their frame of mind. Mozart is always sweet and innocent. Haydn, the jokester. He was famous as a young boy for cutting off the pigtail of the boy in front of him, the desk in front of him. Chopin, it's very, very romantic. Beautiful beyond measure. I mean, it's so gorgeous. It was said that while the greatest pianist at that time was Franz Liszt, who was the greatest virtuoso of all time, maybe even now the greatest virtuoso, it was said that Liszt was the greatest pianist, but Chopin was the only pianist. The only because he taught himself. He figured all that out on his own. Okay. So it's very individual writing. So each of these composers are fascinating to discover and to learn. And as you hear one, you learn more about how to hear the other. And as you hear one piece of music, on the repetition, you learn more and more about how to hear it. It's true with all wonderful music, isn't it? You hear or literature or work of art, painting, on a repetition, you gain so much more from it.
Right.
And the third repetition, even more, and so on. So that's the experience I've had with classical music.
Okay.
It only gets more wonderful.
Right. And that's how you think that the healing power of that actually kind of transmitted to Tear as well?
I think without question.
Okay.
She listens to a lot of Mahler, by the way.
Okay.
She loves the Mahler second, which makes it's a vision of heaven in music. I mean, it's just otherworldly. It's so great.
Okay.
And you work through 45 minutes of symphonic music, and finally you get to the end. And when you get to the end, I'm finally there, and you're that much stronger.
Okay.
It's just wonderful.
So in terms of science, the effect of music on health and how deeply related to that, it's actually still ongoing. On your side is that, I mean, from your experience, do you think that it is, as you mentioned, that different musical notes and different music itself, they actually invoke different emotions?
Well, it's a combination.
Right.
It's a
Okay.
combination of the notes.
Right. Right. The combination of the notes. Right. So when that happens, so is it that kind of uh, change in the mind or change in the emotion actually imports some effect on any kind of illness? Do you think that is the case in this case from your perspective? How it actually, how your music helped uh in the healing process?
Well, you know, except for music, sound a lot of times is discordant.
Right.
It's
Right.
annoying. If it isn't something really what you want, then you just sort of put up with it and it's in the background.
Right.
And you choose to ignore it because it doesn't serve a purpose. But when you hear something which, if you hear the sound of a bird that you haven't heard since you were a child, and all of a sudden you hear that, oh, there's some part of you that goes back to those childhood years. And if you can hear a piece of music that is struggling to get to the end, to have some kind of resolution, and you hear all these different chords and all these different ideas and patterns, but finally it arrives home, you have such a sense of completion, and all of your thinking is absorbed by, is taken up by this sound. So music is very absorbing because you hear it from the beginning to the end. Even if it's a short song, you hear it from the beginning to the end. And so you have a sense of completion, let alone memories.
Right. Okay.
So I think if you hear music that struggles to achieve something, there's one chord in particular which is the healthiest chord that exists.
Of
It's
course.
called the 6/4 chord. Here it is now. It sounds like this. The reason why that's so healthy, because you know if you hear this chord, and it's the only time you hear it, it's followed by this chord, and you know you're going to get that chord. So that's why this, it's a chord of hope, because you know you're going to get some resolution.
Right.
So
Yes.
if you can have that, sometimes Beethoven will land on that 6/4 chord, it's called. He'll land on that chord and maintain it for minutes at a time, not just for a few seconds, but for a long period of time. And finally, at the very end, he'll get to that resolution. Everybody is just so relieved. We finally got there.
Oh my God. So
So,
from in your experience, who is the best musician in your mind?
well, I have partiality to a pianist that I heard when I was younger. His name was Alfred Cortot. He was a French pianist. Paderewski was the prime minister of Poland, the pianist Paderewski, and Cortot wanted to be the leader of France in the same token. He never was. But his playing has a freedom that makes me think that the composer himself is doing the playing. It's not like any other pianist I've ever heard, so I have great love for that. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. The in your mind the best musician. Yes. So
Oh,
is he?
he was one of many wonderful musicians.
Oh, one of the many. Okay, got it. Got it.
They're
Uh,
all wonderful in their own ways, but he's especially wonderful.
right.
When
Okay.
I was a student, I studied with a terrific pianist whose name was Claude Frank. And when I went to Claude Frank, I played for him, and he said to me, first thing he said to me, he said, "You must make it sound like," and I was trying to remember to do this, don't forget that, remember to use the right paddling, the right fingering. He
Right.
said, he said to me, more important than anything else, you have to make it sound like you're improvising it. To improvise. So when musicians sound like they're improvising when they play, like they're just making it up. That's why popular music is so popular, is they sound like they're just making it up.
Right, right.
Classical music has a tough road to hoe because it's so carefully practiced. By the time they get ready to perform it, everybody's a little bit uncomfortable because they don't want to make any mistakes. They want to do it right. And but when I hear musicians play like they wrote it themselves, then I love it. That's the best.
Okay, got it, got it. Okay, that sounds great. And your hero?
My wife is my hero.
Of course, that completely makes sense. Thank you.
When I first met her,
Go
she
ahead,
played
please.
music in such a wonderful way. I thought this is a woman that I could marry, I could live with all my life. She's a terrific musician, she is.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate your time. I learned so much. I cannot tell you how much I learned. So much things to know out there, and especially about music itself.
Wonderful.
During that
So
time.
everything you asked me just made me want to share so much with you. So
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Please take care of yourself. Please give my love and appreciation to Tier as well.
I'll tell you.
How do you like this podcast? Please like and comment on this video and share with your friends and family and whoever you think is going to like this as well. Till next time.